So in part one, we discussed how regular variational inference can be a viable way to train latent variable models, but if we have a separate QI of z for every single data point in our data set, then we have this problem that the number of means and variances that we have to store could be huge if our data set is very large. So in this section, we'll talk about something called amortized variational inference. The reason it's called amortized variational inference is because instead of representing a mean and variance separately for every data point, we amortize the challenges of inference over all the data points by using a neural network that actually performs inference for us. So we'll actually have two neural nets. One neural net, p theta of x given z, that is basically our generative model, and a second neural net, q phi of z given x, which tries to predict a distribution over z given an image. And specifically, it'll predict two quantities, a mean over z and a variance over z. Which essentially means that instead of storing a separate mean and variance for every data point, we just have a neural network that tries to spit them out, that tries to predict them. Okay, so we have two neural nets that we're going to learn, and we're going to use the evidence lower bound. So we still have this property that log p of xi is bounded below. But now, everywhere where we had qi of z before, now we're going to have q phi of z given xi. So now our evidence lower bound is the expected value, where z is distributed according to q phi of z given xi, of log p theta xi given z, plus log p of z, plus the entropy of q phi of z given xi. So the way I obtained this expression is I just took the previous lower bound that we derived in part one, and everywhere where we had qi of z, I substituted q phi of z given xi. That is the only change I made. So it's just a different way of representing qi of z. So it's still an evidence lower bound. And now the training procedure will look like this. For every image xi, or every image in your mini batch, you first calculate the gradient with respect to theta of the evidence lower bound, which means that you sample z from q phi of z given xi, and then you approximate your gradient using that sample by taking the gradient with respect to theta of log p of theta xi given z. And that's very easy to compute using backpropagation. And then you take a gradient ascent step on this. And then you have to take a gradient ascent step on phi by computing the gradient with respect to phi of L. And that part is a little bit more tricky. Phi appears in two places in the evidence lower bound. It appears as the parameters of the distribution under which we compute the expectation, and it appears inside the second entropy term. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Here's our evidence lower bound again. And remember that q phi is just a Gaussian distribution where the mean and variance are given by neural network functions of x. The gradient of the entropy term is pretty easy to handle. You can just look up the formula for the entropy of a Gaussian. It's just some expression in terms of mu and sigma. You can code up that expression in TensorFlow or PyTorch and get gradients for it. That's the easy part. But the first part is a little more complex. One way that we can think about calculating the gradient of the first part is to note that all the stuff inside the expectation does not depend on phi. So we can collect those terms into a single expression that I'm going to call r of xi comma z. And I intentionally chose the letter r because now, writing it in this way, it looks very much like the expression we had in reinforcement learning. Remember, in reinforcement learning, our objective was the expected value of the reward, where the expectation is taken with respect to a distribution determined by the policy. Now we have the expected value of some function r, where the distribution is determined by q phi. So we could just use policy gradient. We can literally use exactly the same expression that we derived in the reinforcement learning lecture to calculate this derivative. And here is that expression. Of course, we can use baselines and all that other stuff, but the simple version would be to just generate some samples, m samples of z, and then average together grad phi of log q phi zj given xi times r of xi comma zj. Okay, that is a viable way to train a latent variable model, and in fact, there are effective algorithms that have used this. but it's not the best way. What's wrong with this gradient expression? Why might we not want to do it this way? Well, the shortcoming of this gradient expression is the same as the shortcoming of policy gradient in general. The variance is large, which means that we might in practice have to generate quite a few samples Zj to get an accurate gradient estimate. That's not actually that big of a problem because generating these Zj samples costs us some computation, but otherwise there's nothing really wrong with it. But there is a much better way, a way that we can train these models that will be much faster and more effective in practice. And it's going to leverage the fact that unlike in the case of reinforcement learning, in the case of latent variable models, we can actually calculate the derivative of R. That's called the reparameterization trick. So here's the idea. We have our expression for which we want to calculate the derivative with respect to phi. But phi is not just any distribution. Phi is a normal distribution, a Gaussian distribution, which means that we could also write z as a deterministic function of the mean and variance, and epsilon, which is a standard Gaussian sample. So z is equal to mu phi of x plus epsilon times sigma phi of x, where epsilon is normally distributed with mean 0 and variance 1. This is because a Gaussian with a non-zero mean and a variance that is not 1 can just be expressed as a affine transformation of a 0-1 Gaussian. So this is always true. But now notice that everything here is deterministic except for epsilon, but epsilon does not depend on phi. It doesn't depend on the neural network. So we can equivalently write our objective as the expected value with respect to epsilon, where we substitute this equation for z in place of z. So it's an expected value with respect to epsilon, distributed according to a zero mean unit variance Gaussian, of r of xi, comma, mu phi xi plus epsilon times sigma phi xi. So this is a function of xi and epsilon. But notice that now phi only appears inside the expectation. The distribution with respect to which we're taking the expectation is not dependent on phi anymore. We've reparameterized the distribution, and that's why it's called the reparameterization trick. So now we can estimate the gradient with respect to phi as follows. We can sample a bunch of epsilons, maybe we sample n epsilons, from a zero mean unit variance Gaussian, although sampling just one epsilon actually tends to work pretty well. And then the derivative with respect to phi is just applied by using the chain rule of differentiation. It's just an average over all m samples of the gradient of phi with respect to phi of r of xi, comma mu phi of xi plus epsilon j sigma phi of xi. And we can calculate this derivative using our favorite automatic differentiation software. The reason that we could not do this in reinforcement learning is that in reinforcement learning, the derivatives of the rewards were not known to us, but now they are known, and now we can do this. So most automative software will actually compute this for you. Now, if this seems a little bit abstract, I'll actually walk you through exactly what the resulting model looks like, and it'll be maybe a little bit more obvious how all these derivatives can be computed. Okay, so here's another way that we can look at our evidence lower bound objective. What we'll do is we'll take the first term and we'll break it up into two parts. An expected value under q phi of log p theta and an expected value under q phi of log p. And the reason I broke it up that way is because theta only enters into the first term. The second and third terms are independent of theta. In fact, if we group the second and third terms together, we'll notice that it's just the negative KL divergence between q phi of z given xi and the prior p of z. And this KL divergence often has a very convenient analytical form. If both q phi of z given xi and p of z are Gaussian, KL divergence between two Gaussians has a closed form expression that you could look up in a textbook or on Wikipedia. And it's just a formula that you can code up in TensorFlow or PyTorch, and it will calculate your derivatives for you. So it's very convenient to express the evidence lower bound like this, because all the hard stuff is basically in the first term. The second term is pretty easy. You just code up the formula for it, and you get the derivatives. And then if we apply the reparameterization trick, then that first term becomes an expected value under a noise distribution, zero mean unit variance, of log p theta of xi given mu phi xi plus epsilon sigma phi xi. So both theta and phi now appear inside the expectation, and the distribution under which we're taking the expectation doesn't depend on either of the parameters. And we can estimate this using just a single sample of epsilon, so it's a single sample estimate, by just plugging in that epsilon. And now this is an expression that we can just code up in TensorFlow or PyTorch, and we'll calculate the derivatives for us, and that's it. So it maybe is instructive at this point to draw the resulting neural network. We have xi, which goes into a network with parameters phi. And that network outputs two things. It outputs a vector of means over z, mu phi xi, and it outputs a vector of variances over z, sigma phi xi. Then we have our noise. Our noise is generated from a zero mean unit variance Gaussian. We multiply it by sigma, and then we add mu, and then it gives us z. So that's just a mathematical expression. Just implement exactly this formula in TensorFlow or PyTorch, and that gives you z. And then z goes into a second network with parameters theta, and that network outputs p theta of xi given z. And now all you have to do is write down the evidence lower bound, basically implement it in code, and that evidence lower bound is just going to consist of the log probability p theta xi given z, computed using this network directly from xi, and additionally this KL divergence, and the KL divergence is just a function of mu phi of xi and sigma phi of xi, so it's just another loss term. And then your favorite autodiff package, like TensorFlow or PyTorch, will give you derivatives using backpropagation. And that's all you need. And at that point, you just do gradient ascent on both theta and phi with respect to that objective. So that's how you implement a variational autoencoder. And the reason this is called a variational autoencoder is, of course, because if you look at the structure of this neural network that I drew at the bottom, it looks like an autoencoder. It has an encoder with parameters phi, which has this, somewhat unusual noise, mean, and variance thing at the end, and it has a decoder with parameters theta. So it's just an autoencoder where the noise is put into the hidden state z instead of being put in the beginning like we had in the denoising autoencoder. So in the denoising autoencoder, we added noise to x. In the variational autoencoder, we add noise to z. But the variational autoencoder has this very appealing interpretation as a latent variable model. All right, now using reparameterization versus policy gradient, what are the trade-offs? Well, the policy gradient, given by this expression, can handle both discrete and continuous latent variables. So if you do want a variational autoencoder with discrete latent variables, policy gradient is the way to go. But it has high variance and requires multiple samples and small learning rates. The reparameterization trick only handles continuous latent variables, so you can really only do this if z is continuous and ideally Gaussian. But it's very simple to implement and tends to work quite a bit better if you can use it.